Here we go again, looking at session number 80, in Mark 14, looking at verses 43 through 52, with something we have entitled Betrayal and Arrest. We left the discussion from Gethsemane last time with this ominous statement by Jesus. Arise, he's talking to Peter, James, and John. Arise, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. The consequences of the betrayal are about to take place in real time, a true historical event. This is not a made-up event. It actually happened. Let's go to Mark chapter 14, verse 43, and begin. And immediately, while he, Jesus, was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a multitude with swords and clubs, from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. We think that maybe Mark included this comment about Jesus or Judas to remind us how to highlight the nature of the tragedy about to unwrap. This wasn't just one person leading another person to arrest. This was a close confidant, one of 12 people closest to Jesus for the last 3 years, who is doing this deed. The three groups that were mentioned are those present in and central to the work and workings of the Sanhedrin. But notice that technically Mark didn't say that those three groups were present, only that those in the arresting company came from or were sent by those people, those three groups. So let's look a bit deeper, if you will. That seems to be our custom, doesn't it? John 18, chapter 18, verses 2 and 3. Now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, that was Gethsemane, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests, which would have meant the temple guard, the security force for the temple in Jerusalem, and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Now, Mark just said they came with weapons, but he doesn't highlight lanterns and torches as much. In other words, it was dark, remember, probably well after midnight, so they would need to be able to see who they were dealing with. Now, we tend to think this was a ragtag bunch of people off the street who want to come in and arrest Jesus. Ain't so. It was some Roman soldiers, apparently, according to John, and some of the temple guard, the officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Not sure exactly the implication of having the Pharisees there, but it may be that they sent some of their own people along with us. But this was not a public meeting. This was well drawn up. The people were there for a purpose. And John says they came with plenty of light and weapons. So this was a well-planned attack, if you please. It wasn't simply, again, a bedraggled mob consisting most likely of predominantly temple guards responsible for temple security, but including also some Roman guards, probably so that they could know what was going on and could let the Roman leadership know how it was handled. But John indicated there were Roman soldiers in the mob. He's the only one that I know of that did so. And they were probably there to see that things went smoothly and to be ready to keep order if there were to be some violent opposition, which there wasn't really. One would naturally expect some chief priests, scribes, and elders would be present to watch the matter, see how it went down, see if it went down well, but they evidently didn't make up the majority of those who were present. The majority would have consisted of the active agents, the temple guard, and the Roman soldiers. Notice there's no mention of the presence of any Passover pilgrims. Remember, the Sanhedrin said we can't do this at a time. They said we can't do this during the feast, but what they meant was we can't have the general pilgrims at Passover. We can't have them involved in this arrest. We have to be able to take him quietly. And that's what they're doing exactly. Low population outside of those mentioned, and at the deepest, darkest time of night. We suspect well past midnight, because it probably would take past midnight for the Seder meal to have been conducted, for Jesus to introduce the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, and to go through the discourse in the upper room, followed by the walk across the Kidron Valley and up the slopes to the Garden of Gethsemane as they sing the last half of the Hallel. But the mob was armed. They were ready to deal with any form of opposition or insurrection that might occur. None did, of course. There was a minor event in the middle, which we'll get to, but nothing serious. And in John 18, verses 4 to 9, John adds some upfront information before they get into the rest, this is before Mark's version, if you please. Jesus, therefore, John 18, 4 to 9, Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, that was the group that just arrived, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus the Nazarene." So the temple guard and the Roman soldiers said, "We're looking for Jesus." And Jesus said to them, "I am." Now you generally read this as "I am he," but it's ego eimi, however you want to say it, which says it is effectively the self-declaration of deity, "I am." Yahweh, effectively. And Judas also, who was betraying him, he's in this group, he hasn't come forward yet in John's version. He was standing with the temple guard and the Roman cohort. Wherefore Jesus said to them, "I am." They, the group that come in to get him and arrest him, drew back and fell to the ground. And I'm sure you've heard plenty descriptions and sermons and teachings on what it meant. Why did they fall to the ground? What power was Jesus exuding, even though he wasn't physically taking a part. I'll leave that for you and your memories of those sermons. Again, therefore, this is verse 7, again, therefore, Jesus asked them, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus the Nazarene. So once again, Jesus answered, I told you I am. If therefore you seek me, let these, I assume pointing to the other 11 and maybe more, let these go their way. Why? That the word might be fulfilled which Jesus spoke, of those whom thou hast given me, I lost not one. That came up in several places in the book of John, where Jesus said, I haven't lost anyone, of course, except for Judas, which he didn't lose as a sign of failure. He lost because Judas was decreed for that position, as he promised and declared earlier in the upper room. And of course, that's in John's, beginning with chapter 13 perhaps, but principally chapters 14, 15, and 16, and into 17. John 17:12 is another place where John adds a bit. While I was with them, and this is Jesus speaking, I was keeping them in thy name, which thou hast given me, and I guarded them, and not one of them perished, but the son of perdition, that the scripture might be fulfilled. So back in chapter 17, in the upper room, Jesus had made that statement. Now he's telling the group coming to arrest him, let everybody else go. You want me, you got me. Let everybody else go, so that I have kept my word. Now, in Psalm 41:9, there's even another interesting comment. It says this, even my close friend, in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, and remember that's how Jesus identified Judas as one who would take the piece of bread that he had dipped into the sauce, and he handed it to him, he ate it and took it. The one who I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. So Judas is making that prophecy come true. Now the whole event had been well planned. In Mark 14:44, if we go back to Mark, now he, that's Judas, who was betraying him, had given them a signal, saying, whomever I shall kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard. So this had been an arrangement. And by the way, the words in there for kissing him meant some kind of a fervent kiss, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It was not just a peck on the cheek. And they said, the minute I do that and identify him, evidently some of the temple guard and Roman soldiers probably had never met Jesus, so did not know what he looked like. But this was a signal to tell them, this is the guy, he's the one you want to take. So immediately take him and take him away with guards so that he can't escape, I suspect. Why would they need for Judas to identify Jesus? Well, I just said that a minute ago. Likely because the temple guards in the Roman cohort did not, all of them, recognize Jesus. Perhaps they had never seen him. That's what we would suspect. We are not told. So how did it go down? Look at verse 45 of Mark 14. And after coming, he, Judas, immediately went to him, Jesus, saying, Rabbi, and kissed him. And again, Mark doesn't tell us a whole lot. He's the guy of few words, if you please. Matthew adds a bit. In Matthew 26:14-9, Matthew writes, and immediately he, Judas, went to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi. So Matthew adds a word or so, and kissed him. And Luke says in Luke 22, verse 48, but Jesus said to him, as Judas, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? So there's some discussion and few words spoken that Mark didn't see fit to include. And again, as I said a while ago, the Greek implies that the kiss was more than a peck on the cheek. It is described as a furtive kiss. I'm not sure what that means myself, but it's described as a furtive kiss that normally implied an indication of affection. It was often used as a kiss of greeting among those with affection, one for the other. In this case, the kiss lasted long enough to be recognized as the stated signal. It wasn't just a peck on the cheek. It was truly an act of betrayal and an act of hypocrisy in the same, if you please. Well, what's next? Look at verse 46 of Mark 14. And they, this is probably the temple guard and any Roman soldiers who were there, laid hands on him, Jesus, and seized him. Then the unexpected happened as we look at verse 47. But a certain one of those who stood by, and the way this is put together in Greek, it sort of implies that Mark knows who it was. He doesn't say so, but he said, one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. You know what I think? Whoever it was, and we'll get at that in a minute, took the sword, was going to come down on the top of the skull to split it wide open, but evidently the guy moved or the aim was bad, and he simply cut off his ear. And as I remember in one of the other instances, it's described as his right ear, not his wrong ear, I guess. Again, Mark, who most likely knew who did the deed, tells only part of the story. Let's move to Luke 22 to see more of this story. Luke 22, I'm going to look at verses 49 and 50. And when those who were around him, Jesus, saw what was going to happen, that the soldiers and the temple guard were going to seize Jesus and arrest him, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? So there must have been swords present. But without waiting for a response, and Luke says, and a certain one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. You knew Luke the doctor would get which ear it was. Luke tells us that 2 of the 11 had swords. We see that in Luke, a little earlier, Luke 22:38. And they said, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. So the 11 had 2 swords with them. And Jesus said to them, that's enough. And even that's not the entire story. Look at Luke 22:51. But Jesus answered and said, "Stop." This is after someone took off the slave's ear. "Stop, no more of this." And he touched his ear, the one that was cut off, and healed him. Only Luke tells us about that healing. The others do not tell us anything. But who lost his ear and who did the deed? Well, John helps tell us a bit. John 18:10. Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave. That would be the high priest, not just anybody's slave, Caiaphas' slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. The man losing his ear was the high priest. That's Caiaphas again. Probably, but it could actually be a servant of Annas also, who had been high priest before his son-in-law Caiaphas. It's most likely Caiaphas' servant, but it could be Annas instead. So, then what happened? Well, go back to John 18, verses 11 and 12. Jesus, therefore, said to Peter, the one who had done the deed, "Put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. They didn't want him escaping now that they had him quietly in the dark middle of the night arrested without public incident. Jesus went peaceably. Remember, he said, no, don't do that with the sword and so forth. He went peaceably, but he offered a protest. Mark 14, verses 48 and 49. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as against a robber, or an insurrectionist probably?" Although it's not stated. But then they came armed, ready to deal with any opposition. And then it continues with Jesus' words, "Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me. But this has happened that the scriptures might be fulfilled." Jesus said, I'm not doing anything secret. I'm doing it all publicly in the most public event or public entity in Jerusalem, namely the temple. And you didn't say a word to me in the temple. You didn't try to arrest me. You didn't try to stop me, even though I did a number of things that your leaders didn't like. But I was there, but you didn't touch me. Jesus was simply pointing out that he did nothing in secret, but he taught openly in the most public place in Israel, in Jerusalem, the temple. They evidently had no argument with what he did or taught then, at least not enough to arrest him. So why now? And to fulfill what prophecy? Well, I've got a couple of prophecies from the Old Testament you can look at, and you can decide. They are some of those that the scholars think were in play. And one or two of these we've seen before. Isaiah 53:12. And This is a famous chapter in Isaiah about the servant, the suffering servant, the Messiah. Therefore, I will allot him, this is Yahweh speaking, I will allot him a portion with the great. Remember it said that he was destined to be buried with the poor in a potter's grave type of setting. It says, therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he himself bore the sin of many, and interceded for those transgressors. Or how about Zechariah 13:7 that we've looked at before? Zechariah 13:7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and against the man my associate, declares Yahweh of hosts. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. At that point, the courage of the 11 faded. It dissipated. It crumbled. Mark 14:50, and they all left him and fled, from Peter, James, John, and the other 8. But Mark added a curious ending to this narrative. I'm sure you've been over this one many times too. In 14:51-52. And a certain young man was following him, that's Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen sheet, we'll talk about that in a minute, over his naked body. Evidently had no underclothing on. And they seized him. But he left the linen sheet behind and escaped naked. Started to say negatively. No, he positively got away. Yeah, I know. You've been told that this was John Mark as a young man, very young man, and that seems to be the consensus of scholars as well. So be it. But do you like the description of the guy wearing only a sheet? Well, there are several points that might help with that. Notice what kind of sheet Mark's version says it was. Said it was a linen sheet. Why not a wool sheet? That would be what most people would have on if they had one. Linen was too expensive for the common person. So what does that mean? If this is John Mark, does that mean his family has some measure of wealth? Well, we don't know, but they did have a house at which Jesus had been on occasion, I suspect, and later, after the resurrection and ascension, Peter ends up at Mark's house. A couple of words that are of interest here, to me at least. Sindon, S-I-N-D-O-N, which is an outer garment normally worn to bed. Why was it worn to bed? Well, you didn't wear any underclothing. This was just like a nightgown, I guess. But it's called Sindon, S-I-N-D-O-N. Then there is another one called Chilton, C-H-I-L-T-O-N, an undergarment normally worn under an outer garment, except when in bed. Why do I make a point of that? I'm not sure exactly. says, so anyhow, you get the picture that the young man may have been in bed wearing only a sindan with no chilton when aroused to join this event. When seized, he was grabbed apparently. He tore away, leaving his sindan, his outer garment, and escaping without undergarments, going away naked, I guess. Someone believed that he escaped, and that's what I've just given you, that he escaped wearing only the chilton. Some say he wasn't actually naked. He would have had the chilton on. Well, there's no evidence for that either. So anyhow, you've got the pieces there, you've got the words. So take it as you will. Some wonder why Mark included the last two verses. My guess, he probably wanted believers to whom he was writing this gospel to know that he was there. He's not speculating. He was there. But he didn't want to claim anything beyond that. Only that he was there. Not that he had any principal role of any sort. Anyhow, now Jesus is standing here. He's been taken captive. He's been bound. He's going to be led off somewhere without his closest men. He's alone, at least in terms of human companions. He has no companions who remain loyal and with him. That's dissipated. The trials are about to begin, and that's where he's going to be led. They're going to begin at the homes of Annas and his son Caiaphas, who is the current chief priest, or head priest. We're going to have a little problem because Mark again tells us a very small, short version of what happened at these trials. These trials, Jesus is going to undergo trials in the Jewish religious setting. 3 events particularly, one at Annas, one at Caiaphas, and one at a formal meeting of the Sanhedrin. First time just simply to interrogate Jesus, find out what they can. The second one is to bring the formal charges and to affirm some formal charges with him. And the third is where the charges are filed. And so we'll see that, but Mark does not separate out those 3 pieces. So we're going to have to look at Matthew, Luke, and John extensively, even more than looking at Mark, to be sure that we take a serious, complete, understandable look at the events that are about to happen in the dead of night through to early morning. Let's see.